I came home on Christmas Eve to an empty house, and the first thing I noticed was that my daughter-in-law's car was gone. Not just gone for errands, gone the way a place feels when no one intends to come back to it soon. The coat hooks by the front door, usually buried under parkas and scarves, and the kids' snowsuits were bare. The kitchen smelled like nothing. No turkey in the oven, no cinnamon, none of the things my wife used to fill this house with before she passed. Just cold air and the hum of the refrigerator. I set my grocery bags down on the counter and stood there for a moment listening. I'd driven 40 minutes through a snowstorm to pick up cranberry sauce because my son Nolan had texted me that morning asking if I could grab some on my way over. On your way over, as if I hadn't already been planning to spend Christmas Eve at the house I owned. The house I'd let them live in rent-free for 4 years. I walked through the kitchen, through the living room. The Christmas tree was still there, decorated, lights on, but the presents that had been under it, the ones I'd wrapped for the grandchildren, were gone. All 4 of them. Taken. On the kitchen table, there was a note. Nolan's handwriting, rushed, like he'd written it in the car. Dad, something came up. Had to leave. Back in a week. Don't worry. Don't worry. My son left me a note that said, "Don't worry," on Christmas Eve, and took my grandchildren to God knows where, and expected me to just make myself a sandwich and watch the news. I sat down in one of the kitchen chairs and read the note 3 more times. Something came up. I'm 67 years old. I've worked 31 years in municipal planning for the city of Ottawa. I know what something came up means when a person writes it without looking you in the eye. I called Nolan's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I texted. Nothing. I called my daughter-in-law Priya. Her phone didn't even ring. Went straight to a foreign dial tone, the kind you get when someone's already landed somewhere with a different area code. That's when I understood. They hadn't left for an emergency. They'd flown somewhere warm, somewhere that required planning, packing all 4 of the grandchildren's things, loading up the car well before I arrived. While I was at the Farm Boy on Merivale Road buying cranberry sauce at my son's request, my family was already at the airport. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I sat in that kitchen for maybe 10 minutes, and then I got up, put the cranberry sauce in the fridge, and I started to look around. It started 4 years ago after my wife Eleanor died. We'd been married 41 years. We had Nolan late. He was born when Eleanor was 38, and we spoiled him the way people do when they've waited a long time for something. Not extravagantly. We weren't wealthy people. But we gave him everything we could. Good schools, piano lessons, hockey equipment, a used car when he turned 17. When he married Priya 10 years ago, we welcomed her like she was our own. She's a smart woman. Sharper than Nolan in most ways, if I'm being honest. After Eleanor passed, I couldn't stay in the Barhaven house. Too many rooms, too much silence. I'd already owned this property in Kanata, a larger house I'd bought as a rental investment in 2009. My tenant had just left, and rather than find a new one, I offered it to Nolan and Priya. They had 3 kids at the time, expecting a 4th. They needed the space. The arrangement was simple. I would move back into the Barhaven house, rent out the basement to offset costs, and Nolan and Priya would live in the Kanata property rent-free in exchange for maintaining it. No formal lease. Family arrangement. I trusted my son. I kept paying the property taxes. I kept it under my name. All of it documented, all of it above board, because I'm a man who spent 30 years working in municipal administration, and I understand what paperwork means. What I didn't understand was what was happening beneath the surface. That first night, Christmas Eve, after I called Nolan's phone 6 more times with no answer, I walked through the house more carefully. Not snooping. I want to be honest about that. I was looking for anything that might tell me where my grandchildren were. I'm their grandfather. The oldest, Marcus, is 9. The twins, Adaisy and Sophie, are 6. The youngest, little Owen, just turned 3 in September. 3 years old, and his parents had packed him up and taken him somewhere without telling me. In the hallway closet I found ski equipment. All of it gone. The kids' helmets, the rental boots they stored there, Priya's jacket. Not a family emergency then. A ski trip. I went into the small room off the kitchen that Nolan used as a home office. The door was unlocked. On his desk, half buried under some papers, was a printed itinerary. I don't feel guilty about reading it. It was sitting right there. Whistler, British Columbia. 7 nights at a resort called Needle Lake Lodge, 4 lift passes, 2 adults, 4 children, flight from Ottawa to Vancouver, December 24th, departing 7:15 a.m. They'd left before I even woke up that morning. The itinerary had a total at the bottom, $11,400, not including meals or ski rentals. I put the paper back where I found it and went and sat in the living room for a long time, looking at the Christmas tree. At some point, I fell asleep in the armchair. I drove home to Barhaven the next morning, Christmas Day, through streets that were perfectly empty. I remember thinking that I had never spent Christmas alone in my life, not once in 67 years. I didn't tell anyone. Not my sister up in Sudbury. Not my old colleague Bertrand, who I still meet for coffee every other Tuesday. I didn't want to sound like a man complaining about his children. I wanted to understand first. What I understood over the next few days, as Nolan's phone stayed on voicemail and Priya's went unanswered, was that the silence itself was a kind of answer. On the 27th, I drove back to the Kanata house to pick up some tools I'd lent Nolan months ago. While I was in the garage, I found a box of files on the shelf beside the water heater. Nolan's handwriting on the tab. It looked like he had slipped off a higher shelf. Half the papers had spilled out onto the floor. I almost left it. I should have left it. I didn't. The papers were financial records, loan documents mostly. Nolan had taken out a home equity line of credit, a HELOC, against the Kanata property, against my property. $62,000, borrowed over 18 months, starting about a year after they'd moved in. The bank documents listed him as the property owner. I sat down on the garage floor with those papers in my lap. My son had forged my signature. He had represented himself to the bank as the owner of a property that was registered in my name, and somewhere along the line, someone had not done their job because the loan had been approved, $62,000. I looked through the rest of the papers. There were receipts, a 2022 Audi Q5, $48,000, a renovation to the kitchen in a condo listed at an address I didn't recognize, a down payment receipt. My son owned a second property, a condo, somewhere in Gloucester, purchased 18 months ago, with my money. I sat in that cold garage for a long time. Then I put every paper back in the box, tucked it under my arm, and I drove home. I have a lawyer. Her name is Patricia, and I've used her for estate work since Eleanor died. I called her office on December 28th and left a message, and she called me back within the hour, even though it was between Christmas and New Year's, and she was half on holiday. I drove to her office and spread the papers out on her boardroom table. She looked at everything carefully. She didn't say much while she was reading, just made small sounds, the kind a person makes when they're thinking hard and not ready to speak yet. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at me over her glasses. "Gerald," she said, "I know the character isn't Gerald. This is Patricia speaking to the narrator." The word her lips formed was the narrator's name, and I'll get to that. She said, "This is fraud, bank fraud and title fraud. Do you understand what you have here?" I said that I thought I did. She told me the first thing I needed to do was get a title search done immediately to confirm nothing else had been registered against the Kanata property. The second thing was to contact my bank and place a fraud alert. The third thing was that under no circumstances should I confront Nolan before we had a complete picture. I did everything she said. The title search came back the next day. No additional encumbrances beyond the HELOC, which was some relief. But the fraudulent HELOC was real, registered against my property, Nolan's signature on documents that should have borne mine. Patricia filed a report with the Ottawa Police Service. She also drafted a letter to the bank. Then she asked me what I wanted to do about the property itself. I told her I wanted my son and his family out of my house by the time they got back from Whistler. Legally, properly, with the appropriate notice, but out. She nodded like she'd expected that. "And the grandchildren?" she asked. I thought about Marcus and the twins and little Owen. I thought about 3-year-old Owen eating breakfast at Needle Lake Lodge while I ate toast alone on Christmas morning. "The grandchildren have done nothing wrong," I said. "Whatever happens between Nolan and me, Those children are my grandchildren. I'll make sure they're not left without." Patricia nodded again, and she started writing. Nogan called me on January 2nd, the first call in 10 days. "Hey, Dad." His voice was easy, casual, the way it gets when he's trying to feel out a situation without showing his hand. "We just got back. How was your Christmas?" I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea. I had Patricia's file folder open in front of me. I looked at the title documents and the bank fraud report, and I kept my voice very calm. "It was quiet," I said. "How was Whistler?" A pause. "You knew we went to Whistler?" "I found the itinerary," I said. "I was at the house Christmas Eve. You left me a note." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, look, I can explain." "I know about the HELOC, Nolan." Silence. I let it sit there. 30, 40 seconds of absolute silence. I'd worked in government long enough to know that the person who talks first in a silence like that is the one who's scared. He started talking. The story came out in pieces, the way lies always do. Not a clean confession, but a negotiation. Each admission calibrated to what he thought I already knew. The HELOC, he said, had been a temporary thing. He'd planned to pay it back before I ever found out. The condo was an investment. He'd intended to tell me eventually. Priya's parents had lent them some money too. It was complicated. The market had been difficult. I let him finish. Then I told him that I had filed a report with the Ottawa Police Service, that Patricia had notified the bank, and that he had 30 days to vacate the Kanata property per Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act provisions for owner use of property, though given the absence of a formal lease. Patricia had advised the process would be more straightforward than that. He said, "Dad, you can't be serious." I told him I was entirely serious. He said, "Where are we supposed to go? We have 4 kids. It's January." I said that was a question he should have asked himself before he borrowed $62,000 against my house to buy himself a condo in Gloucester. Another long silence. "You know about the condo." "I know about the condo," I said. "You can live in it." The calls started after that. Nolan, twice a day. Priya, once. Very composed, which surprised me. She tried to negotiate, which I'll give her credit for. Her parents called, her mother was kind and her father was angry, and I understood both reactions, but neither one changed anything. My sister called from Sudbury after Nolan apparently reached out to her. She said, "Ray," the narrator's name, the name I chose for this story, is Raymond, Ray for short, and that's what his sister calls him. She said, "Ray, are you sure about this? In the middle of winter with 4 little ones?" I said, "Kathy, he has a condo." She was quiet for a moment. "He does?" 3 bedrooms in Gloucester, paid for with my money. She didn't call back to argue. By mid-January, I had received formal confirmation from the bank that the fraudulent HELOC was under investigation. Patricia informed me that the police file was active. Nogan had retained his own lawyer, someone he presumably paid for with money that wasn't fraudulently borrowed, though I didn't ask. They moved out on January 29th. I drove by the house that evening, after I knew they'd gone. I'd arranged for a property manager friend of mine, someone I'd worked with at the city for 20 years, to do a walkthrough with me. The house was in decent shape. They hadn't trashed it, hadn't been vindictive. Priya had cleaned the kitchen, which I noticed and which I thought said something about her, whatever else had happened. Standing in the living room where my grandchildren had opened presents and learned to walk and eaten birthday cake, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger. Something quieter and sadder and more complicated than anger. I sat down on the floor. There was no furniture left, just the hardwood, and I sat there for a while. My property manager stood near the window and was decent enough to say nothing. In February, I set up a registered education savings plan for each of the 4 grandchildren. I put $5,000 into each one: Marcus, Adaze, Sophie, and Owen, with myself as subscriber and each child as beneficiary. It's their money, not Nolan's, not Priya's. It will be there when they need it. I also set up an informal fund through Patricia's office, a small discretionary trust designated for the children's extraordinary needs: medical, educational, anything their parents can't provide. Nolan can't touch it. Priya can't touch it. Priya can't touch it. It's mine to administer until the children reach adulthood. Patricia asked if I wanted to disinherit Nolan formally. I thought about it for a long time. I didn't. Not because I've forgiven him. I'm not there yet, and I won't pretend otherwise. But because I know what it does to children when their parents are cut off entirely from family money. And those 4 kids didn't choose their father. They didn't choose any of this. What I did do was update my will so that any inheritance passes directly into trust for the grandchildren, bypassing Nolan and Priya entirely. Patricia says it's airtight. I rented the Kanata house to a retired couple from Baldesmonts, who came with references and paid their first and last month's deposit without hesitation. They send me a Christmas card or they will. I have a feeling they're the type. The kind of tenants a person deserves when they've spent too long trusting the wrong one. The HELOC fraud case is ongoing. Patricia tells me the bank's legal team is pursuing Nolan for the repayment, and that the criminal file is still open. I don't know exactly where it will land. I've stopped trying to predict it. What I know is that I own my house again, cleanly. I know that my grandchildren have money set aside that no one can touch. I know that I spent 41 years building something honest with Eleanor, and what our son did with that honesty was his choice, not ours. In March, Nolan sent me an email. He said he was sorry. He said he made decisions under financial pressure that he wasn't proud of, and that he hoped eventually I could understand. He didn't ask me to drop the police report. He didn't try to negotiate. He just said he was sorry and that he loved me. I read it 4 times. I haven't written back yet. I'm not sure I know what to say that would be both honest and kind, and I've decided I'd rather say nothing than say something that's only one of those things. But I kept the email. That matters, I think. I kept it. Last Sunday I drove out to Gloucester. I don't know exactly why. I knew the address from the documents Patricia had shown me, the condo Nolan bought with borrowed money, the investment property, the secret. I didn't get out of the car. I just sat in the visitor parking and looked at the building. It's a nice building. 12 stories, brick. The kind of place that went up in the early 2000s in that part of the city. There were lights on in a unit on the 4th floor. I don't know if it was theirs. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, and then I thought about Marcus at 9 years old, who loves hockey and hates mornings, and who spent Christmas in Whistler through no fault of his own. I thought about the twins starting school this September. I thought about Owen, 3 years old, who can't understand any of this and never should have to. I'd put the car in drive and I went home. I have a good life. A quiet one, but a good one. I have a property that's legally mine again, a lawyer I trust, a coffee appointment with Bertrand every other Tuesday, and 4 RESPER accounts that are growing 1 contribution at a time. I have a sister in Sudbury who calls on Sundays. I have 41 years of a marriage that was honest and full. Whatever Nolan did, he didn't take any of that. He tried, maybe without knowing he was trying, but he didn't succeed. I'm 67 years old. I've still got time to make the rest of it count. I keep thinking about that Christmas tree. Still lit, ornaments untouched, the house warm and decorated, as if a family lived there. And nobody home. There's something in that image that tells the whole story, if you look at it long enough. Nolan and Priya hadn't just left for a ski trip. They'd built an entire parallel life. A condo, a line of credit, a set of signatures that weren't mine. And they'd done it inside a house that I owned, while eating dinners I subsidized, while calling me dad. The deception required effort. It required planning and patience and a willingness to look me in the eye without flinching. What I've had to sit with in the months since is the question of how a person gets there. How do you arrive at that place where you're forging your father's name on a bank document and still picking up the phone to ask him to grab cranberry sauce on his way over? I don't think Nolan is a bad person in the way the word usually gets used. I think he made a series of choices, each one slightly worse than the last, and at some point, the choices had compounded so far that honesty felt more dangerous than continuing. That's not evil. That's a failure of character. A slow erosion of the basic integrity that keeps a person from crossing lines they'd have been horrified to cross a few years earlier. Eleanor and I gave him everything we could, And somewhere in that giving, I think we forgot to make sure he understood that the things worth having are the things you build honestly. That's my part in it. I've thought about that too. What pulled me through wasn't anger. Anger was there, certainly in the early weeks, sitting on the floor of a cold garage reading loan documents with numb hands is not a feeling I'll forget easily. But anger by itself doesn't move you forward. What moved me was clarity. The moment I spread those papers on Patricia's boardroom table, and she looked at me over her glasses and said, "This is fraud," something settled in me. I knew what was real. I knew what was mine. And I knew exactly what I needed to do next. That's the thing nobody tells you about being betrayed by someone you love. The hardest part isn't the betrayal itself. It's the discipline required afterward. To not act from rage, to not make it worse, to think carefully, move methodically, protect the people who are genuinely innocent, those 4 grandchildren who didn't ask for any of this, and let the consequences land where they belong without adding cruelty on top of justice. I've lived 67 years now. I spent 31 of them working in a field that required patience, precision, and the understanding that systems hold when people do their part honestly. That's not glamorous work, but it taught me something about what holds and what doesn't. The things built on shortcuts eventually show the cracks. The things built carefully, a marriage, a property, a trust fund for 4 grandchildren, those last. Raymond Haynes is not a man who got even. Raymond Haynes is a man who got clear. And that, I think, is enough.